Tudor portrait discoveries are always exciting, and even more exciting when it's a Tudor that we don't have many portraits of to start with. I was therefore thrilled when earlier this year a portrait by Nicholas Hilliard of Lady Arbella Stuart, a one-time major contender to the English throne, was unearthed and identified by historians Elizabeth Goldring and Emma Rutherford. Today I have the pleasure of welcoming both Elizabeth and Emma onto the show for a discussion all about this painting, from how they found it, how they identified who it was, and what the portrait can tell us about both the court of Queen Elizabeth I and Arbella Stuart's position within it. Welcome back to the Tudor Chess Podcast, episode 57, Lady Arbella Stuart, a portrait discovery with Elizabeth Goldring and Emma Rutherford. Welcome to the Tudor Chess Podcast, Elizabeth Goldring and Emma Rutherford. How are you both?
Very well, thank you.
Yeah, very well, despite the onset of autumn today.
Yeah, it's really changed, isn't it?
It really has.
Last couple of days. So, thank you both for coming onto the podcast. You are my first duo. My guests have always just been a solo, so you're my first duo, which is nice. But we're here today to talk about a wonderful portrait discovery that you made that was released earlier this year of Lady Arbella Stuart, one of the sort of key, I suppose, lost figures from history. A lot of people won't necessarily know too much about her. But before we get into that discussion, if it's okay, just wanted to ask you a few get to know you questions, really. So can you provide me with a short intro into both of your backgrounds, so where you grew up and what you now do full time? Maybe come to you first, Elizabeth.
Sure. Well, I grew up in the US. I have lived in England for the last 25, nearly 30 years. Most of that time I've been affiliated with the University of Warwick Centre for the Study of the Renaissance. I'm currently an honorary reader there. I did my PhD at Yale in Renaissance studies, and going right back to the time that I was a graduate student, the Tudors have always been my main interest, my main field of research. I am particularly interested in Tudor painting and Tudor court culture, but honestly, anything Tudor is interesting to me. And it's just a thrill to get to surround myself with Tudor manuscripts and Tudor art on a day-to-day basis. I feel incredibly privileged to get to do that. And
you, Emma?
I have not got as an exotic a background as Elizabeth, but born and bred in England, currently live just outside London. I studied at Bristol, and then I did a master's in Victorian art and architecture, and in fact worked at the Victoria and Albert Museum for the year that I did my master's.
My favourite.
And I was assigned to the portrait miniatures department, or part of their paintings department was the miniatures. So I really got up close and personal and ended up writing a dissertation on Victorian portrait miniatures and how photography came in and the effect that had on the artists and need for miniatures. And I now run a company called the Limner Company, which is a consultancy totally focused on portrait miniatures, and I buy and sell miniatures, but I also work for institutions and occasionally, as was my luck with Elizabeth, get to write for academic journals and lecture and that sort of thing.
Lovely. So was there a moment maybe in your childhood or something that particularly sparked both of your passions for Tudor history, Tudor art?
Well, growing up in the US, I always loved English history and English literature. Those were always my favorite subjects at school. But I think the specific focus on the Tudors really probably started for me after a family holiday to England the summer that I was 14. And I just thought it was so thrilling to see in the flesh places that I had read about in history books. And in particular, Hampton Court Palace made a big impression on me. And I still remember that really thrilling sensation of thinking, gosh, and am I walking on ground that Henry VIII's feet touched hundreds of years ago? And that sense of shivers down the spine of kind of really connecting with history. And I think that planted the seed of an idea that it would be really lovely to find a way to have a career that enabled me to, study the things that I loved and be immersed in subjects that interested me all the time. And I think probably it was around that time that I started thinking, maybe one day I might want to do a PhD, and maybe I might want to write books one day.
Lovely. And you, Emma?
Yeah, fairly similar in that it was a building and that probably got me really hooked on the Tudors. My parents took me to Hever Castle probably in my early teens, and they had a portrait miniature there that was supposed to be of Anne Boleyn, but I've no idea now, of course, whether it was anything, a genuine miniature or a reproduction. But I think for me, the idea that Henry VIII might have held this miniature in his hand and what he might have felt, obviously at that age, I was very bound up with the romance of their affair and marriage. It just, like Elizabeth said, I just got so excited by getting that close to history and almost being able to step back in time. So that early encounter with a miniature and that sort of material culture of the Tudor court, something that's always really excited me. And I'm lucky enough, like Elizabeth, to be able to live, breathe, work in that area. So I don't think many people get to do that as their day job.
Yeah, it's a lovely position to be in, isn't it? I'm in exactly the same boat. And it's funny how much Anne Boleyn is often a bit of a gateway drug for a lot of people.
For sure.
It's hilarious, running my Instagram account and all of the stuff that I do, time and again comes out number one person that people are most fascinated by, including myself. So I'm one of those.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure she's kind of looking down and thinking, still got it.
Yeah. Well, I always describe Elizabeth's success as it's the biggest cosmic fuck you in history, isn't it? Really?
Yeah.
So, Elizabeth, if you could pick a single moment from history to go back and witness, you can jump in a time travel machine, what would it be?
Well, I would absolutely love to be a fly on the wall for Nicholas Hilliard's first encounter with Elizabeth I, the first occasion on which he took her likeness, which is something that he describes in his treatise on miniature painting, which has a lot of autobiographical passages. And when I was writing my biography of Hilliard a few years ago, I was able to piece together clues to show that encounter occurred in July 1571 in a garden at Hampton Court. All roads in my life seem to lead back to Hampton Court. So it was really thrilling to piece those clues together, because Hilliard, in his account, doesn't say exactly when it occurred or which palace they were at. But it would just be so lovely to hop in that time machine and see what they talked about and just see how the entire encounter unfolded. That would just be thrilling.
And you, Emma?
Well, boringly, fairly similar. And we haven't actually talked about our answers.
No, we haven't. We didn't compare.
You're going to regret having a duo on now. But Hilliard went to Paris in the mid-1570s just for a couple of years. And a few years ago, I was lucky enough to work on a portrait that he painted of Henri III, a portrait miniature that was probably painted in the Louvre. And Henri III was such a fascinating character, and not particularly nice character, only Valois king to be assassinated, so not liked by almost anybody. But I took the miniature to Paris to show to the curators at the Louvre a few years ago, and I had, because of the insurance around this miniature, I had to stay in my hotel room and order room service. But my hotel overlooked the Louvre, so I propped Henri-Trois up on the pillow of my bed so that he could look over the Louvre while I ate my room service, and then took him back to the palace where it was possibly painted. It just made me think an awful lot about what that moment might have looked like, how Hilliard was, how he saw Paris, how that particular court treated artists were much, much better than they were treated. They had a much higher status than at the court of Elizabeth, and the sort of inspiration that Hilliard might have got. He was also supposed to have been sent as a sort of spy. Obviously, you have to get quite close to your subject if you're painting their miniature, and he could speak fluent French. So I think the English court hoped Hilliard would come back with some wonderful information for them. But not sure that he ever did.
And do you both have what you could call a Tudor pet peeve? Maybe Emma, will start with you this time. Is there something that gets your goat?
Gosh. I guess not really get my goat, but in fact, I only just saw these questions about half an hour ago, and I thought, oh crikey, do I have a Tudor pet peeve? But probably going back to Anne Boleyn, it's just all the sort of myths around the figures. I mean, Elizabeth and I are really lucky in that we get to approach things from a very academic, evidence-based point of view. It doesn't mean that we don't feel quite emotionally connected to the subjects, despite them being from 450 years ago. But I think there are so many myths around, particularly Henry VIII's queens, that probably really irritate me. Plus, always the wrong portrait of Shakespeare. I think that the newspapers always use the one that's definitely not him. Probably my other one. Sorry, that's two.
That's fine.
Elizabeth.
You're allowed to have two. And Elizabeth, how about you?
I don't know if this counts as a pet peeve per se, but I'm always surprised by how persistent this belief that 16th century England was completely cut off from the continent seems to be. It's very persistent, this myth of England as this very isolated, insular place under the Tudors. And I mean, one of the things that always amazes me whenever I go into the archives is how much evidence there is of the exchange of goods, of ideas. People were moving back and forth with amazing frequency, particularly when you consider how difficult the traveling conditions must have been. So in my own writings, I'm always keen to stress the points of connection between England and the continent in this period. And I'm always delighted when I see other people doing the same. And I hope eventually that, this idea that England wasn't so cut off during the Tudors will gain wider acceptance.
There's Estelle Perront's really good at sort of defending that side of things with Anne Boleyn. Actually, I don't know whether you've seen her latest book, Thorns, Lust and Glory, but it totally repaints the downfall of Anne Boleyn and sort of shows how much of an impact the way she was abandoned by people in Europe had a big impact on Anne's downfall itself. Which is, again, as I say, she's one of the few examples, to your point, who does really lean into that side of things. Absolutely.
There's so much to lean into there. Yes, I think it just enriches our understanding when people do, look for those connections.
Absolutely.
Yeah, in art as well. Obviously, the artists are not working in a vacuum. They're seeing all sorts of things coming backwards and forwards from the continent. So yeah, it applies to art history. Yeah.
And with Hilliard, I mean, we think of him as the quintessential English artist, and yet, as you were just talking about with his time in France, I mean, he spent a lot of formative periods on the continent. So yes, so many examples we could cite.
Well, we are here today to talk about a portrait discovery that you both made that is of Lady Arbella Stuart. I was so excited when this came out because, one, I love a new portrait discovery, because I think that's one of the most exciting parts of history, is when we find these portraits, we're able to put a face to a name and things like that. So, Elizabeth, before we talk about the portrait itself, I thought it'd be wise to just maybe quickly discuss who Lady Arbella Stuart is, as she isn't necessarily in the, I suppose, what we could call the Tudor A-list. So could you just provide a bit of a description on who actually Lady Arbella was?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's absolutely right. She was incredibly important in her own lifetime, but for various reasons has been slightly forgotten in the intervening centuries. Though, who knows, perhaps this portrait discovery will get her back into the Tudor A-list. But just a few basic facts. She was born in 1575. Her parents were Charles Stuart, Earl of Lennox, and Elizabeth Cavendish. So on her father's side, she was a direct descendant of Henry VII, and she was also related by marriage to Mary, Queen of Scots. Her father was Lord Darnley's brother, so quite an incredible family tree. Both of Arbella's parents died by the time she was about 7, so orphaned at a very young age, she was taken in by her mother's mother, Bess of Hardwicke, who raised her, for the most part, in Derbyshire at Hardwicke, though they made occasional forays south to London and the court, and we'll probably touch on one of those visits south later in the podcast. Bess, of course, was incredibly rich, probably the second richest woman in England after Queen Elizabeth. She was also, of course, extremely ambitious and great at engineering socially advantageous marriages for her children. It was no accident that her daughter had married the Earl of Lennox. And so Arbella, because of her extraordinary lineage, was from a very young age someone who was frequently being put forward as a possible bride in various high-profile, high-stakes dynastic marriages. So, for example, when she was only 7 or 8, she was talked of as a possible bride for Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester's infant son, Leicester obviously having been no stranger to ambition himself. So from a very young age, Arbella was someone who was seen as potentially very useful in all sorts of dynastic power plays. And I think I'll leave it there. That sort of sets the scene.
Brilliant. Thank you. And I like that you brought up Bess of Hardwicke, because I think she's such a badass. I'm a big Bess of Hardwicke fan.
She's amazing, isn't she? Absolutely fantastic.
Really big fan. So Emma, is there any truth in the often repeated story that she was for a time considered the natural heir to Elizabeth I?
Well, I think, as Elizabeth's explained, instead of the Stuarts, we could easily have had the Arbellian era. I mean, she absolutely had royal blood through her parents' marriage. As Elizabeth has said, she was the great-great-granddaughter of Henry VII. So she has an incredible claim to the throne. In fact, she's one of, I think, only 2 claimants. Obviously, the other one being another cousin, who eventually became James I and sixth of England. So, yeah, she's incredibly important, and it does amaze me that she is sort of less well known. I mean, you can't get more A-list than being one of only 2 claimants to Elizabeth's throne. But as most people listening to this will know,
because by then the younger Grey daughters had both died as well, hadn't they? Because they were obviously high on the list as well.
Yes, absolutely. But I mean, Elizabeth herself kept Arbella and Bess of Hardwicke, who probably punched a few walls with frustration, really strung along in terms of naming her successor. And as people probably know, it's only on her deathbed, when pressed by a minister to formally name the King of Scots as her heir, I think she drew a circlet above her head to indicate that, yes, he was to become her heir. But I think when we get to talk about the portrait, when this was painted, there was absolutely no reason to think that Arbella didn't have a fantastic claim to the throne, and a lot of people didn't like James because he was Scottish, whereas Arbella was English. So in fact, she at this stage had a lot of advantages, including being young and potentially a great pawn in the European marriage market.
Because of her royal blood and the prominence of her in the English nobility, obviously, she was always going to be pulled in different directions, and her story ultimately ends in sadness. So, Elizabeth, what happened at the end of Arbella's life?
Well, it's a very sad story, actually. She died in 1615 in the Tower of London, where she had been imprisoned for the previous 4 years. She was just about a month shy of her 40th birthday when she died, and she basically starved herself to death at the end. The catalyst for her imprisonment was her secret marriage in 1610 to Lord Beauchamp, who, like Arbella, had a potential claim to the English throne. So their marriage without King James's permission inevitably raised red flags. Were they plotting a coup? It really wasn't a wise thing for her to have married Beauchamp, much less to have done it in secret. James, to be fair, initially showed leniency to Arbella, whereas Lord Beauchamp was chucked in the tower straight away. Arbella was not, but she really sealed her fate when in 1611 she tried to escape from England by hopping on a boat to France, disguised as a man. It's an amazing story, and made it almost all the way to Calais, I think, before...
Yeah, she was so close, wasn't she?
She was,
Yeah.
and then the kingship overtook hers and she was brought back to England, and by that point, of course, James felt he couldn't trust her at all, so she went in the tower. And it's really a terribly sad story. She was, I can't remember if it was you or Emma used the word pawn a few moments ago, but that really sums it up. She was throughout her life, I think, a pawn in other people's plots, and on the rare occasions that she did have free agency, as when she decided to secretly marry Lord Beauchamp, possibly didn't exercise the best of judgment. So a very, very sad end for her, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that she isn't more well known, I think, is a real travesty, because her story was remarkable and really fascinating. And, as we've said, were it not for James, we could have very well had a Queen Arbella. It's entirely possible.
We absolutely could. No, it's an amazing, amazing story. And Emma and I have often said, it seems to cry out for a Netflix miniseries or some such.
Yeah.
Exactly. Elizabeth Fremantle, if you're listening. Let's have Arbella next.
She was on my podcast last week to talk about Firebrand.
I saw.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Onto the portrait itself. Emma, where did you discover it? How did you discover it?
Well, it didn't have a very sort of exciting discovery, in that I went to an event and was talking to a conservator, and he showed me an image of this miniature on his phone. So it's quite a sort of modern thing to have first seen it on a mobile. But obviously I nearly fell over and just hadn't ever seen anything like it. And he was describing the scale because he was conserving it in his studio. And I looked at it and I could see all the symbols on her dress. She has these armillary spheres and stars and all sorts of things. And as hopefully your listeners will be able to see an image of the portrait, she's standing in a garden next to a building. So there just seems so much to go on. So I very boldly said, I think I can work out who she is. And on the basis of me saying that, the conservator put me in touch with the owners, and they engaged me to research it. And then after researching it for a month or so, I realised that one really, really potentially important candidate was Arbella Stuart, but that almost seemed ridiculous and too good to be true. But I contacted Elizabeth, and then we started our real detective work together. So that's where I first saw it.
Amazing! I love that you saw it on someone's phone, and then it just snowballed from there.
Terrible, really.
Yeah, have you seen that thing for a few weeks? Again, the guy discovered it was on my podcast about a month ago. That portrait discovery of Henry VIII. There was this art historian, Adam Bushakiewicz, and he was it's this missing portrait of Henry VIII, and he was just on Twitter, and a photograph came up of a room in a house in Warwick, and in the background there is this painting, and he immediately knew that was the missing painting. He sort of went down this rabbit hole and found it. So it's a similar sort of thing, and that he just spotted it online and discovered this lost painting.
I love that there's still discoveries out there, especially on this scale. That's what we're all hoping for, isn't it? Just more discoveries of things. So, Elizabeth, who is it painted by?
It's painted by Nicholas Hilliard, who was Queen Elizabeth's favourite, most trusted portraitist from the early 1570s, when he first portrayed her at Hampton Court to the end of her reign. He was also the first native-born English artist to achieve fame internationally in his own lifetime. Catherine de' Medici and many other continental patrons and collectors of note are known to have greatly admired Hilliard's work. He is, of course, most famous for his miniatures, but in fact, he turned his hand to all sorts of things, anything that would pay the bills, really. So we know that he also painted large-scale oil portraits. We know that he designed jewelry. He devised templates for all sorts of metalwork for implementation by goldsmiths. He devised illustrations for book printers and book illustrators. So he had his fingers in many pies, but it was as a miniature painter that he was most celebrated in his own lifetime, and as a miniature painter that we chiefly remember him today.
I always think of him as like the Elizabethan Holbein, isn't he? You know, he's the person that
absolutely
comes along and gives us a window into the court.
It's so true, because like Holbein, just as Holbein really defined both for contemporaries and posterity what Henry VIII and his leading courtiers looked like, Hilliard did the same thing with Elizabeth and her leading courtiers. Chances are, if you have a mental image of someone from Elizabeth's court, it derives in some way from an image that Hilliard created. Pretty much everybody who was anybody at Elizabeth's court, once Hilliard has the Queen's seal of approval, wanted to be portrayed by her. And an awful lot of people who weren't really very important also wanted to be portrayed by Hilliard, because it became a huge status symbol to have your portrait painted by him. So yes, you're absolutely right. The parallel with Holbein is a good one. In fact, I'm writing my current book on Holbein, and it's interesting seeing those parallels.
I believe, Emma, that the portrait is slightly unusual for Hilliard because it's quite a bit bigger than most of his work. Is that correct?
That's right, yes. So we think of miniatures from this period as being, maybe three inches high, oval, round. But this is a large, virtually a sort of A4 size portrait, and it is rectangular. And it's called, they were called cabinet miniatures, or we now call them cabinet miniatures, because these larger format miniatures, which are still painted in exactly the same way as the smaller miniatures. So this is a sheet of vellum that is that's painted with watercolor and body color and shell gold and silver, and all using all of the techniques that Hilliard employed in his smaller miniatures. But cabinet miniatures, of which we know fewer than 10 in existence by Hilliard, were painted for small cabinet rooms where in stately homes where people would retire after dinner to look at the wonderful treasures of the house. And they were meant to be hung on the wall rather than encased in some sort of jewel or locket to be worn on the body. And the really exciting thing about the discovery of this miniature, I mean, among so many exciting things about it, is that it is the only finished cabinet miniature of a female subject that Hilliard painted. So there's an unfinished cabinet miniature in Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, but this is the only finished female subject by Hilliard in a cabinet miniature.
Elizabeth, the question that I'm fascinated to know is, how did you determine that this depicted Arbella?
Well, it was a case of piecing together multiple clues from a variety of sources. There was no single smoking gun, as is usually the case with Tudor portraits. Normally you're looking for clues in a variety of sources. You're looking for visual clues, you're looking for written clues. So I think our starting point probably was the fact that everything about the iconography of the picture, from the sitter's dress to just the general style of the portrait, pointed to its having been executed in the early 1590s. So that gave us a fairly narrow window in terms of the time period within which we were looking for documentary clues. And we were obviously delighted to discover that Bess of Hardwicke's accounts, which are preserved at Chatsworth, showed that in July 1592, she had paid Hilliard for a greater picture, and greater in Elizabethan English meant bigger, not better. So we suddenly realized that we were probably looking at a record of payment for a cabinet miniature. Now, of course, nothing is ever straightforward with Tudor history, and this record of payment doesn't specify the subject of the greater picture. However, other documentary sources, mainly court correspondence, revealed that in late 1591 and early 1592, a portrait of Arbella, specifically by Hilliard, repeatedly had been requested in connection with a possible marriage between Arbella and the Duke of Parma's son. So all roads just seem to be leading to Arbella. And in looking at portraits thought to depict Arbella, though there were question marks hovering over the identifications with some of those. But in any case, in comparing the face of our sitter to the faces in these other portraits, there did seem to be some similarities, and certainly nothing that was so, nothing jarring that would disqualify, that would rule out the possibility of the same person having been the sitter in all of those images. Though obviously it's always subjective when you're sort of comparing facial likeness. But basically all roads just seem to lead to Arbella.
That's, one of the things that I find so frustrating as well with a lot of portraiture. Particularly, we talked a bit about Anne Boleyn earlier. If you look at all the many portraits, firstly, we all, we know that none of them were done from life, but not a single portrait, the face is the same. Every single image of Anne Boleyn, the face is different. Mm-hmm. And it drives me up the wall, but...
Yes,
it really is. It really is
complicated.
So Emma, did the dress of the subject, with what Arbella is wearing, did that give you clues? Did it sort of immediately tell you that the sitter is someone very highly born?
Yeah, it's hard to understate just how impressive and expensive the dress and the jewels are that the sitter wears in this portrait, and only somebody with Arbella's status and this gown. Elizabeth and I spoke to a costume historian at the V&A because Elizabeth found some accounts. We were obviously looking for articles of clothing that matched the portrait, and we did find this cobweb lawn, which might be the veil that she's wearing. But the costume historian at the V&A said, of course, a gown like this would have taken at least a year. They would have turned up in London with this gown. There's no way they could have cobbled it together while they were in London. So, and she said this is court dress. It's the most formal type of dress that could be worn, and could really only be worn at court. But Arbella, if she did ever wear this at court, would have caused an absolute sensation. The amount of gold and silver on the dress, the this sort of fringing at the bottom. There's even silver thread going through her little shoes that are peeking out at the bottom of her dress. It's astonishing what she's wearing.
For anyone who maybe hasn't seen the portrait yet, can you just describe it in a bit more detail for me, Elizabeth? Do we know, for example, where Arbella is actually depicted, where she's meant to be?
Sure. So it's about A5 size and rectangular, and the sitter is shown dressed to the nines in court dress, as Emma just told us. She's standing outdoors in a garden with an imposing brick building behind her on a sunny day, brilliant blue sky behind her. She is standing on grass, and next to her is a tree, a sapling, which has open white flowers and small black fruits. We talked to various experts, and the general consensus was that this was not an identifiable tree from nature, but intended perhaps as an allegorical representation of fruitfulness and fertility. We were able to establish that Arbella is here depicted in a garden at Greenwich Palace. This was possible to establish from looking at Bess's accounts, the same documents that recorded the payment to Hilliard in July 1592. These documents are just brilliant. They enable you basically to chart Bess's whereabouts and Arbella's whereabouts on a near day-by-day basis. So we know from these accounts that they left Hardwick in Derbyshire in the autumn of 1591 and came down to London and stayed at Bess's house in Chelsea for 8 or 9 months. And within that 8 or 9 month period, spent several chunks of time as guests of the Queen at Greenwich Palace. And in fact, the payment to Hilliard was made at the very end of one of these extended stays at Greenwich Palace, during which Bess, who was a big tipper, she was always tipping, and every last penny got recorded in her accounts. She was frequently tipping the Queen's gardeners during these visits to Greenwich, as if perhaps she and Arbella and Hilliard had inconvenienced them. So I think we can pretty safely say that this is Arbella at Greenwich Palace in the summer of 1592. And there's a very nice echo there for someone who was a possible successor to the Queen, being portrayed thus when, as we know, Hilliard had first portrayed Elizabeth in a garden in 1571 in the summer at Hampton Court Palace. So there's kind of this nice echo. And in fact, if you were to glance quickly at this cabinet miniature of Arbella, you could easily mistake it for the Queen. It bears more than a passing resemblance to the Ditchley portrait of Elizabeth. And in fact, when I was first sent an image of this on my phone, I was actually at the beach in very bright sunlight when I opened the email, and I didn't have my sunglasses on. It was quite hard to see. And I thought, why is someone sending me, they said they're sending me a Hilliard, why they've accidentally attached the Ditchley portrait. What's going on here? And it is, there's I think, an undeniable sort of attempt here to evoke Elizabeth herself, which is very, very interesting.
Has there been any damage or colour changes to the portrait, if you're able to tell? The reason I ask that is when I first saw it, the hair, as depicted in the painting, is very blonde, whereas in other portraits of Arbella, her hair is much darker. So has there been a change in the colour over the years, or is it is it just the way it was?
No, I mean, when I very first saw this portrait, it was terrifyingly unframed and vulnerable. But at some point it must have hung on a wall, because that was the intention for all cabinet miniatures, and it clearly has suffered from some light damage, just as any watercolour might have done over that number of centuries. But it is in surprisingly good condition, considering that clearly it had been tucked away and not really cared for however long. But you can see the face in the portrait. There's a little loss of definition there, and the lightening of the hair. We know that a red pigment in watercolor is one that can fade much more quickly than other pigments, and is often left looking rather pinky rather than red. So it's possible that those red tones used to describe the contours of her face are faded, but no, it's in absolutely incredible condition, considering what might have happened to it. And the fact that it was really unprotected when I first saw it. So no, it's a fantastic survival, it really is.
Do we know, Elizabeth, as best we can tell, was there a specific reason that this portrait was created? I think you mentioned earlier about a possible marriage alliance.
Absolutely. We know from various pieces of court correspondence, as I mentioned earlier, that Arbella's portrait, specifically by Hilliard, repeatedly had been requested in late 1591 and early 1592 in connection with a possible dynastic marriage to Ranuccio Farnese, the son of the Duke of Parma. But what became clear once Emma and I started looking more closely into all of this was that these were no straightforward run-of-the-mill dynastic marriage negotiations. In fact, they seem to have been part of a strategy, an espionage or counter-espionage strategy devised by William Cecil Ward Burghley and his son Robert, who by the early 1590s were basically running the Elizabethan spy services after Walsingham's death, and were also, of course, great patrons of Hilliard's. This seems to have been, these marriage negotiations seem to have been part of a strategy devised by the Cecils to drive a wedge between Philip II, who of course was Protestant England's archenemy at this time, and the Duke of Parma, who was Philip's Governor-General in the Spanish Netherlands. Whether the Cecils and, more to the point, Queen Elizabeth actually would have sanctioned such a match had push come to shove, I'm not sure, but they certainly seem to have been very keen in late 1591 and early 1592 in giving every appearance that these were genuine marriage negotiations and that such a marriage was on the cards. And of course, as you will know, the exchange of miniatures was an integral part of dynastic marriage negotiations in this period and would have been seen as a sign of the seriousness with which Bess and Arbella were approaching the negotiations. We don't think, given the pristine condition of the miniature that Emma was just alluding to, for that reason, we don't think that the miniature ever was sent to the continent. In fact, this whole scheme seems to have unraveled in the spring of 1592. The Duke of Parma was very badly wounded and ended up dying later that year, but I think he was clearly a dead man walking from spring 1592 onwards. But what Emma and I speculate is that this ruse, this political ruse that Bess and Arbella and Hilliard seem to have entered into at the behest of the Cecils, may have planted the seed of an idea in Bess's mind and maybe got her thinking, well, hang on, why shouldn't Arbella be portrayed by Hilliard? She is, going to have other dynastic marriage offers, perhaps, and why shouldn't she be portrayed by Hilliard? So we think that the miniature commission grew out of an espionage plot, but then came to be co-opted by Bess for her own purposes, if that makes sense.
Wheels within wheels, essentially.
Yes.
So, Emma, we discussed a moment ago about the fact that painting has a passing resemblance to Elizabeth I. Do you think this was deliberate, or was it sort of just down to the fact that as they were related, there would have been a likeness between the two? Or do you reckon it was quite a deliberate choice to paint her in a way that emulated the Queen?
I think it wasn't just a deliberate choice. I think it was quite a daring choice. And it's sort of, you say about Bess of Hardwicke being this quite an interesting character and a formidable woman. I think only Bess probably could have got away with a portrait like this of her granddaughter. As Elizabeth said earlier, it's so close to the Ditchley portrait, which is in the National Portrait Gallery, which is a large oil painting of Elizabeth, but it dates to the same year. So anybody who was aware of that portrait and saw this cabinet miniature would have made that association. But there are other things in this cabinet miniature that are directly connected to Elizabeth, but also that seem to almost pit Arbella, who is 16 in this portrait, against Elizabeth's age and her growing inability to bear children due to her advancing age. So yeah, the sort of youthfulness of the sitter, the flush in her cheeks, all these fresh flowers, the sapling, the white. It all looks rather sort of beautiful and virginal and fresh. Whereas Elizabeth in the Ditchley portrait is beginning to look quite old. But there are other more sort of subtle things, or maybe not so subtle things, in the cabinet miniature that connect the sitter to Elizabeth. So her lovely sleeves are sewn with these gold armillary spheres, which they were a personal symbol of Elizabeth. So in other portraits, Elizabeth is wearing armillary sphere earring, for example. So it's pretty bold to put yourself wearing dozens of the Queen's personal symbol. So yeah, it's a very daring, bold counterbalance to the existing portraits of the Queen in many, many ways.
I see. Okay. And to your point, I think if anyone was going to have the bravery to do it, Bessa Hardwick would be high on that list.
Oh yeah, she had the balls to do it.
Brilliant. Well, to end the discussion, I'd love to know, given the job that you do, what would be, because I think things like this must be the greatest part of your job when you unearth something like this. So to that end, what Tudor art discovery or missing piece would you love to unearth? Elizabeth, I've come to you first.
My dream would be to find the lost Veronese portrait of Sir Philip Sidney. I wrote my PhD thesis on Sidney, so he has a special place in my heart. And the Veronese portrait is something that is described in great detail in a lot of Sidney's correspondence. We know so much about the circumstances under which it was commissioned. We have a lot of eyewitness descriptions of it. It probably does not survive, but I live in hope that one day I'll be at a car boot sale, and there it will be.
And how about you, Emma?
Well, Queen Victoria and Prince Albert really loved the royal miniatures, and they spent evening after evening arranging them in order and making notes about them. And obviously, the royal collection went back to portraits of Henry VIII. But one thing I can never forgive them for, and Elizabeth probably knows what I'm going to say, is that they took every miniature out of its original frame and commissioned a frame maker to make these very blingy gold or gilded frames. So even the beautiful Holbeins, we don't know what their original frames looked like, and nobody has been able to discover where Queen Victoria and Prince Albert stashed all these original frames that would have been around Holbeins, Hilliards. Yeah.
I didn't know any of this.
So if we're at the same car boot sale, I want to see all those amazing Renaissance miniature frames in a pile somewhere. That's my dream.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for both coming on to have a chat today about this amazing portrait and the discovery that you made. A couple of things just for people to be aware of. So I believe that there is currently an exhibition of several miniatures by Hilliard on display at a new exhibition, The Reflected Self Portrait Miniatures 1540 to 1850 at Compton Verney House in Warwickshire, that opened last weekend. And Elizabeth, you have a book, Nicholas Hilliard, Life of an Artist, which was published about 5 years ago, I think. Is it still available on Amazon?
It is, and I think it's in the Compton Verney bookshop and other good bookshops as well, but it's definitely available on Amazon, yes.
Brilliant. And for anyone interested, Compton Verney is in Warwickshire, which is in the Midlands of England. So if you're in and around that area over the next few weeks, do definitely check out that exhibition. So where can people find you both? Do you have presences on social media? Elizabeth, if I come to you first.
Yes, I'm on Instagram. It's elizabeth.goldring.
And Emma?
Yes, also on Instagram, and I am portrait_miniature. But I also have a website, which is www.portraitminiature.com, which has lots of blog posts and information on portrait miniatures on there as well.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you again so much for coming on for a chat, and hopefully we'll speak again at some point soon.
Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
And so that brings us to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and a big thank you to Elizabeth and Emma for coming onto the show. Next week, I'm pleased to be welcoming back my friend and colleague, Dr. Sarah Morris, who will be having a discussion with me all about the 1502 progress that was taken by King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. That will drop next Thursday. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess Podcast, and speak soon.